If we desire to help somebody or to sell something that we think can be very helpful to a number of people, why might some group of peoples so resist it? I know, for instance, based on a friendship I've had for a long time with a rather notable artist who was once a professor in the art department of a college, his having exclaimed 15 years ago to me, "Why won't people take their medicine?" in terms of buying his artwork that was at a gallery for sale. Thus, he considered his artwork to be medicine, to be very, very needed, very useful, and yet he found so people buying it. And it was consternating to him on several levels, cognitively and, of course, financially. And so you have to wonder, why do some people want to grow, you would say? Don't we all want to grow and be more? And yet reject advice, reject help. Why might that be? Well, several things come to mind to me at this point. First, how humble, so to speak, is the offerer of the advice? And how pushy, so to speak, or not pushy are they? Especially with respect to speed as to it is delivered, and how much at one time. Is it basically forced on a person also by way of there sometimes being a captive audience for a period of time, and then they're bailing out, they're fleeing, so to speak, feeling under too much pressure? And perhaps the word humility is tied intricately to being respectful. And who wants to buy or listen to our content or think it's going to be useful if they feel slighted as per their self-esteem? In fact, not being respectful could be tied again to the concept of a narcissistic wound, although I do not prefer the word narcissist or narcissism. But at any rate, if somebody feels slighted as to their self-esteem, if they feel, quote, insulted, why would they want to listen to you unless they're under dire pain? And solving the pain would be preferable to not listening to the advice, even at the risk of having their self-esteem impacted negatively. Maybe they prefer their longevity to their emotional self-esteem issues. Isn't that then also why it's unlikely we would receive compliments, or in other words, comments and validation about our strengths from somebody who feels, again, slighted by us, or call it insulted or narcissistically wounded? Now, another component, and a biggie, I believe, is the conflict between wanting to grow and at the same time wanting to feel strongly powerful. And the term omniscient comes to mind. Dr. Anne Schaaf, who passed away a couple years ago and wrote several books to include When Society Becomes an Addict and Women's Reality, has mentioned this packet of words revolving around omnipotence or else omniscience, and that we have often in us, at least in certain people, a strong desire to believe they are a god, so to speak. Again, all-powerful. For if we believe we're all-powerful, we would feel invincible, wouldn't we, concerning any pain ever inflicting upon us again, any suffering, because we would be able to somehow evade it as an all-powerful being ourselves. Well, I suppose there are various ways to be all-powerful. You could be all-powerful in terms of weaponry of a physical nature to inflict injury upon someone you don't prefer to be influenced by. You could be all-powerful, though, also in terms of knowledge. If you knew everything, then you would be invincible, wouldn't you? You could figure out an answer to everything. Isn't that then perhaps why Marie Forleo had a book come out, and it was a bestseller on the New York Times list? Everything is figure-outable. Well, I suppose before figure-outable, a neat component would be to say, alternatively, I know everything already, and so any particular problem coming up in the future, I can figure it out because I have the mental capacity and all the necessary precursor knowledge to figure it out or evade in general future pains, especially those that had inflicted me in the past of a similar nature, or those I see could come to anybody in the future, especially if I've seen it to happen to some already. So some people might like to feel invincible, call it a desire for power, in most all of us, by physical strength over and above those of others. Or maybe they desire to have considerable monies to apply to problems in general as a power source over possible pain in the future. Or maybe they have been endowed with great good looks, call it beauty or handsomeness, and that can have great sway. Or maybe they have a number of powerful allies, and that can give them a sense of power, if not real power, and thus a feeling of some degree of invulnerability from pains in the future. Yet another source of power is for some people to realize that if they are of a mindset willing to compromise morals, cut corners, get ahead, so to speak, by the phrase lying, cheating, stealing, killing, or enslaving, and not have too many conscience compunctions about it, in particular because their level of empathy is rather low, and their feeling of guilt evadable in some way, shape, or fashion, particularly skilled then at blame shifting, then I think they would have a power tool themselves also for possible pain again in the future. But for those who do not fit the bill in any of these areas, perhaps they don't have a considerable degree of money or sex appeal, or perhaps a bunch of allies, so to speak, and maybe are not severely morally compromised to the extent some are, and willing to do anything to get ahead, and maybe some others not so adept or willing to blame shift so readily, or knowing how to, basically. There being yet another option then, that being the option of power through either getting a lot of knowledge to solve problems, or the attempt to believe one has that knowledge already, i.e., feeling omnipotent, so to speak, all-powerful by being all-knowing. Instead, you might say, of being omnipotent, all-powerful by having, again, a lot of money or sex appeal as two prime ways in this world to have power, to have influence, and a feeling thus of safety, or greater safety than otherwise obtainable. I might add at this point, it might ring true to a number of people that a college student and a college graduate, or pursuer of knowledge in general, to the nth degree, is not often going to be a strapping football player or gorgeous model. They do not tend to gravitate in large numbers, I believe, to college, to knowledge acquisition. Hence the derogatory term blonde bimbo. Although there are plenty of party school type colleges out there, but I believe it is quite known amongst most of the students there that the aim is to either hook up with somebody or get that parchment to advance their future careers and safety in general. The degree itself, the piece of paper, serving as a power tool, not in terms of pursuing knowledge per se. And two, those greatly morally compromised, greatly empathetically compromised, might find themselves not wishing to spend so much time in a classroom for 4, 8, 12 years, but simply go the route of Al Capone, so to speak, from the 1930s, and enforce or seek their desired goals with a Tommy gun approach, so to speak, i.e., violence or great forms of aggression, either with weaponry of a tool-type nature, i.e. a gun or something else, or simply to be a sort of bully of sorts, although I don't prefer that term. But to manipulate in these fashions rather than to manipulate our future with knowledge, to evade once again pain as much as possible. In this mean with knowledge or the pseudo-belief one has knowledge already. And therein lies the rub. For who has a lock, so to speak, on knowledge, especially in younger years, and in my opinion, if not pursuing knowledge by way of being an autodidact, often in preference, I would say, to college per se. So those desiring, once again, to pursue a feeling of safety through power or imagined power, through knowledge, to include often going to college to achieve this, for they believe often that that's the best way to achieve knowledge in the most efficient and effective manner overall. Well, then there lies a conflict, I believe. One's wanting to grow, and particularly grow in terms of being happier, and a lot of that having to do in terms with being safe or feeling safer. And yet at the same time, the disconnect of wanting already to feel omniscient, all-knowing, not down the line, say, in 10, 20, 30, 40 years, upon which one would say, I'm rather uncertain about many things, and I'm going to try to keep learning. To defer a sense of power, feeling of safety to 30, 40 years down the road, when one says, aha, then I finally feel a rather wise, knowing person, relatively speaking, would not cut the mustard, I think, in terms of what one wants now, especially as a youth of 20 or 30 who has much to learn from, you might say, the school of life itself in terms of hard knocks alone, not just knowledge of an intellectual, philosophical, or whatever nature. So inasmuch as one wants to feel omnipotent and then omniscient in this sense of a group, one wants it now, not down the line when one is, say, 70 or 80 and is considered, and perhaps often is, a wise Indian chief, say, which took some doing in terms of effort and time and experience in life. We tend to want to feel safe from the get-go, including in our 20s or 30s, and so wish to declare to ourselves having arrived already in terms of this knowledge base being maximal in nature. But then, isn't that a conflict? For if we say we know all, that we are omniscient as part of the package of being omnipotent, all-powerful over pain, then how are we supposed to say we have anything more to learn? And if we have nothing more to learn, why really try to learn? Why even acknowledge that someone else could be beneficial to us, anyone else's content, advice, or ideas, experiences communicated, and so on? Especially if that communicator is not, again, humble, is sometimes insulting, or loads it on too quick, is also bringing it on too quickly in terms of speed. Hence the idea of a fire hose down our throats in terms of knowledge delivered or offered to us. And to add to this, I would say this is particularly notable, I believe, when it comes to understanding philosophy, religion, people, sociology, not when it comes to understanding how to study principles or how to pass a math exam per se. Those things we consider simply acquiring a specific tool. But to believe we are omnipotent and for a certain group of people omniscient and all-knowing would be a much more different thing than simply knowing some particular aspect that we call maybe a tool or algorithm. Those things can be picked up rather easily, but to feel one has a grasp on how best to be happy through one's moral views, one's philosophy of life, it being called a Weltanschauung, perhaps in Europe at one time, that being a totally different thing, I believe, and much harder to make progress on and accrue, so to speak, make it stick. So, while we might say at any point in life that we're willing to accept advice from someone on how best we can fix the plumbing in our house or electrical system or car engine or change even the oil or a tire, we would not so easily, if in a certain group, want to believe we have a long ways to go when it comes to the complexities about human beings. That, then, we wish to assume right from the get-go that we already have, as opposed to saying, well, I don't know it now, but I could acquire it in 10 minutes by watching a YouTube video, say, on how to change a tire or fix a gasket here or there on some widget. If we can't say we can get a strong grasp on humanity in 10 minutes, then we perhaps would like in some circles to say, well, we already know it all already. And so thus, one person I saw on a YouTube video talking about how to be a Facebook group leader, saying that one has to understand that who one is providing advice to as a Facebook leader, one has to take into account that a number of people desire help from Facebook groups and the leader thus, but at the same time want to believe they don't need help, thus that they know it all. Lest, I would say, they feel very discombobulated. Wanting to grow once again, yet on the other hand wanting to feel safe by claiming they already know it all anyway. And therein a big rub. Now I would say, though, a saving grace of those stuck in this milieu, this set of circumstances, is that they probably oscillate back and forth in time, from desiring to claim they know it all, and so don't need to pursue knowledge of any sort, and yet at other times despairing and turning frantically to others, and saying, well, perhaps I really don't know it all, and oscillating back and forth for their whole lives, perhaps sometimes even. Now I would say also, moving on, that perhaps sometimes people would desire not to listen to our advice, not to buy our content in any way, shape, or form, whether written, videos, audio, or artwork, because maybe they often are able to feel rather secure already. Their pain points being fewer, in younger years especially, or at any point in time, because they have not either suffered many skin knees in life, so to speak, or they are basically rather immune from many a pain that some others aren't. And so, one form, too, of feeling rather immune is to be able to say, it's never my fault, my pain. And then, of course, one would never need to look within as to one's own contribution and try to grow understanding of both oneself and others in general. One can simply have the mindset as pointed out by Eric Berne, MD, from the 1960s, who wrote, I'm okay, you're okay, amongst other things, his having been a bright psychoanalyst. And he mentioned, perhaps I would summarize, two main camps. I believe he made a comment of 4 camps, but 2 main ones, I think, statistically speaking. Either I'm okay and you're not okay. In other words, I know all and you don't. Or I'm perfect and you're not. Or every pain I feel is your fault and not my fault. Or the opposite extreme being, everything is my fault and never your fault. In other words, I'm not okay, but you're okay. All of you are okay, but I'm never okay. This phenomenon mentioned in something I listened to just yesterday, an audio talk by Dr. Ann Schaaf about her book, Women's Reality, and her stating that many women believe that they are often wrong and men are often right. Well, that being perhaps a generalization of sorts, but in the group she was working with, this being a real problem. And also I might mention at this point, Dr. Les Carter has written a very fascinating book, amongst perhaps a few, When Pleasing You is Killing Me. And Dr. Shaler has written on this phenomenon too, of being very vulnerable to guiltings, or being guiltable when not applicable. And there yet being another book on manipulation, the book title being something on the order of Stop Being Manipulated. I could come up with a title. And the big point being that fear and guilt, this author, in the latter case, talking of, are the 2 prime manipulators that are often used upon us. And in turn, then, I would say, to make us feel that it's always our fault and never someone else's fault. Dr. Berne goes into more detail on how this could have originated, and I have my own ideas, but I will mention one book also by a psychoanalyst from Europe that made an impact on me too. And that was on the lines of, "Thou shalt not be aware." It might have been written by a Dr. Martha Beck, or I'm trying to remember just who wrote it, but at any rate that could be looked up. Thou shalt not be aware. Aware, she was writing of, especially of sexual abuse, but you might say trauma in general, or being told thus, especially as a child, that the pain you're feeling is your fault, not my fault, as put forth, say, by one or both parents in certain situations. And it being believed all the more by those, I would say, very unempowered, especially physically, whether by way of being a female in general, slighter body size and muscularity, and sometimes you might argue more empathy and more unwillingness to go to the mattresses, so to speak. These factors playing a big role, I believe. But in general, if one can say it's always your fault, and then have ways of doing the logic on that, what I call blame shifting, with logic applied to make it seem plausible, especially if these blame shift logic tools are used in large numbers and very openly. This all then contributing to the "I'm okay, but you're never okay" approach. It requiring logic to do so, and this typically called, I believe, blame shifting, or I would say blame shifting logic tools. Interestingly, one such blame shift logic tool I have seen was by someone who told me several years ago that the, quote, homeless who he has seen sometimes living under a bridge do so because they like to suffer. Another person once told me that someone is suffering because they generally are a masochist in general. These ideas, though, countermanded by a Dr. David D. Burns, who wrote the book Feeling Good, and said in one of his books, if you think people like to suffer, just put a rubber band around your wrist and snap it very hard and see if you enjoy suffering from the pain of that. In other words, that there must be other reasons why someone is suffering and perhaps can't seem to pull out of it. Yet another person has mentioned to me once concerning a person suffering in their marriage for many years. Well, why didn't that person pull out of it? I suppose maybe they were thinking maybe that person enjoyed suffering in the marriage. Or, why didn't they get out of a toxic marriage situation in general? I guess at this point I would say a couple other blame-shifting tools I have seen prominently to include, well, you're just lazy, or you won't pull yourself up by your bootstraps, or you're a freeloader, or you're just a bum. In other words, you chose to be that way, and so you deserve what you get. Hence the phrase, in a sense, if you can't do the time, don't do the crime. As if one had a choice in the matter, if we were to look to the micro level. And one last but not least measure of blame shifting, in my belief, is to simply say someone else is suffering because they have a genetic component that predisposed them to do so or be so. But I would add at this point then, rather humorously, that if that same person making that comment had their television stolen, or their daughter raped, or somebody had shot them and they were maimed for life, I think chances are they would not utter the words, well, it's my fault for suffering because I have a genetic component that makes me oversensitive in my brain cells, my neurons, my biochemistry over having been shot. No, I don't think they're going to say, I'm oversensitive about my TV set having been stolen, and then not do anything about it, including calling police or advocating for more security patrols around the neighborhood, and taking down signs instead of putting up more that says, this is a safe zone neighborhood, or whatever, and signs in the front lawn saying, we support the local police. No, I don't think they're going to say they are oversensitive by way of their genetics and a predisposition for emotional pain from having had their TV set stolen by a, quote, burglar, or again, their daughter raped, or whatever. And they're not going to say, in turn, that their daughter should not file charges against a rapist or urge the police to track down the person because the daughter is simply oversensitive because they have a biochemical imbalance. The same people claiming that other people are oversensitive because they have genetic problems would not be the same comment they would issue about their own pain points when happening to them. Rather a interesting flip, I would say. Other people's pain, genetic. Their pain, a crime. And let's call the police immediately and put them in prison forever, even execute them if possible, is the mindset of some people. In other words, zero tolerance. But for themselves, a lot of tolerance. Once again, I was the victim of a crime, but others are the victim of their genetics, and so a dual standard. A blame-shifting tool extraordinaire, then, and I'm afraid something having gone quite amok, to the extent I almost have to stop talking about right now. And as alluded to, perhaps earlier, that if someone in certain circles suffers something traumatic or painful, it being claimed, well, I could not prevent it from happening, and it's a crime, but other people could have prevented it if they would have tried harder or been more alert to what's going on around them, or not have been so naive. And yet for the same individuals making this call or comment, they might say, no, I was not naive for not having taken enough measures to have my TV set not be stolen or my daughter raped or myself be, quote, conned in general. If others are, quote, conned, it is deemed their fault by way of naivety, and yet the same commenter, if conned, so to speak, themselves, deceived and, quote, falling for it, this called a scam, perhaps, by the same persons, not naivety. That's an interesting flip again, I believe. Now, a couple more avenues here. Perhaps our great content, if in fact great, and very helpful to some and rejected by others, has a lot to do with what you call envy. Or, in my opinion, a feeling that one is stuck in life and someone else, perhaps the content creator, the advice giver in general, is not nearly as stuck. So the phrase comes to my mind, let's cut off our nose to spite the other person. I'm not going to give them the satisfaction of confirming to them that they are way ahead of me in terms of certain areas, including what they are offering me. I'd rather suffer from not getting the content that could help me than to take the content and at the same time be telling them that, yes, they are way ahead of me, and in turn, I am quite stuck. We often find it so painful to be stuck how much more painful to say, I see I'm stuck, not just I feel I'm stuck, and moreover, I don't know if I can do anything about it. Perhaps I often can't. So rather than endure that despair of it all, we might say, I will cut off my nose to spite that person, so to speak. I will not grow if it entails both a recognition of how stuck I am, perhaps forever, in certain areas especially, and secondly, give them the satisfaction of knowing that they are ahead of me in certain ways. And all the more if they then gloat about being ahead of me, by way of not being what you might call humble. I would also add at this point then, maybe many a younger person has not skinned their knees enough in life to have many pain points. They haven't lost many jobs, if any. They haven't lost many relationships, perhaps, if pursuing any at all, in fact, to include, say, a marriage or two down the tubes, or having been jilted once or twice, or what have you. And so maybe there's not enough pain points to say, I really need anyone's advice to begin with. And secondly, this encouraged sometimes by being too enabled in terms of money come too easily with too little effort or skin in the game or what have you, whether from student loans or parental monies. By the time, though, a person reaches 30, these sources of money will have dried up considerably, I believe, as well as skinned knees having started to be incurred from relationships often gone sour or not meeting expectations, along with a few job anomalies, shall we say, fired from positions or not getting the jobs you wanted, especially those, quote, plum jobs for many. That starts to add up, the money starts to dwindle, the student loans start to amount, and for many then, that's a point where they might say, I wish to grow more. To an extent again. But before that point, various factors enabling the person to say, oftentimes, I don't need to grow, and a quick comment might be then, in turn to themselves, I already know it all anyway. And finally, one last comment, I believe. We all might like to be, as Ralph Waldo Emerson mentioned in his essay, Self-Reliance, feel self-reliant. Isn't that then why people in possibly many instances desire to be an entrepreneur or self-employed in general, to have their own business? For the chances are then less likely, or in fact no likelihood being possible of being fired. One is self-reliant in that respect. You might say not dependent. And of course, who wants to live dependent, say, on anyone, including their parents if they don't have to, or be, quote, dependent on a welfare system? We have enough issues with being dependent upon our heart beating and our having only a modicum of control over that, or in terms of getting cancer or not, say. So who wants to be totally reliant if they don't have to be? Especially as a younger person then, escaping or leaving, shall we say, the family, say at around age 18 for many, and going to college or whatnot, getting married, moving away, establishing their own lives, they wish to be more self-reliant. And though the problem then, that meaning too, self-reliant in terms of thinking, yes, thinking for yourself is a phrase that ties into self-reliance, as opposed to being dependent or reliant upon others for one's thinking, and in turn, shall we say, knowledge. Hence, you might say, amongst some, especially younger persons sometimes, well, I either know it all already, or it's being taught to me in college, so I don't need your advice, or finally, I can figure it out for myself, or I already have figured it out for myself, followed by occasionally the comment, at least in their minds, well, you're an old fogey anyway. Your thinking is so slow and you're so forgetful, so you really have nothing to offer me anyway. But at any rate, the drive strong to feel self-reliant and all-knowing, and if one has certain lackings in skinned knees and considerable monies coming in with no tie to the degree of ability to make it with one's wits and contact with reality, so to speak, this all quite a mix here, contributing to rejection of advice that is quite pertinent in many cases. Hence the concept again, cutting off one's nose, or shall we say, the knowledge nose of others to spite them. So one feels once again knowledgeable to the max, i.e. omniscient. Again, in terms of alternatives, especially the alternatives of physical strength compared to that of many, or strength in terms of having power over many by way of being beautiful or handsome. Hence the idea sex appeal. And the phrase, of course, too, if so-and-so is gorgeous, the whole world comes to their feet, or words to that effect. So with all of these factors involved, is it any wonder then why some people's advice is so rejected, despite the high quality of it? One last comment I would say, maybe advice, as per the comment, the truth shall set you free, is not always so the case, especially these days. For maybe truths we convey may be, even if top quality, conveyed at the same time with some mistruths. Hence the phrase in court, to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. How many people do we know who can do that? All the truth, and all of the time. That being very problematic then. Many people then not wanting to hear advice if they don't have the time or the intellect to sort out the truths from the mistruths, and simply saying, I will chuck it all and go my own way so that I'm not contaminated with mistruths by way of not having the time to sort it all out. I'll simply reinvent the wheel from scratch myself to avoid this contaminating process. These then are ideas I have, just to say once again, as to why we might be quite consternated if we as content creators, to include the content in artwork, or even parents, shall we say, if a parent, or maybe even a spouse, or partner, or friend, might find ourselves rejected as to what we would like to convey that could be helpful. It might be totally helpful as to the subject matter, or it might be mixed in terms of its helpfulness. But these factors, I believe, that I've pondered for years now, especially on the topic of rejection in general, I think have a lot to say about one particular grouping of people who we find often might reject either us as a friend or someone to be around, or as to what we have to say. Thoughts here. Oh, and one last comment. Even if we had perfect advice to give, and others might actually sign on, so to speak, to it, listen to it, buy it, what have you, What good is good advice any more than a good cleaning of bed linen, clothing, and sofa furniture from bed bugs or lice? What good is cleaning all of this, or rather our own bodies, only to go back to the furniture and the clothing and the bedding infected? And so, as one psychoanalyst that I had heard talk of, he said he admonished his clients to do no reading of psychology, only to listen to him as per the sessions the client would come into. So that, I guess, they would not be contaminated, so to speak, with ideas that he believed at any rate would be countermandering what he was saying. Indeed, those who have suffered religious trauma by way of a cult may find themselves as a youth kidnapped by someone a parent has hired, taken off to the woods or somewhere else for a couple weeks, and deprogrammed by being told certain truths, we hope, and at the same time restricted on the other person's part from ingesting any mistruths or countermanderings of the truth. You might say countermandering marketing, or in certain circles the word propaganda used. Now, I don't prefer the word propaganda, but what happens if, in general, someone accepts our advice as potentially very useful, listens to it, tries to follow it, buys it, and then the next minute turns on the TV set, or reads a magazine or a book, or talks to a friend, or goes down the street, and what you told them, or they bought even, for a fee, is countermandered by all the elements in society, many mistruthful to a degree. You have then a war of concepts, some helpful, some not. If you're providing concepts that are overall helpful, and their environment is providing concepts that countermand it often, that's of the phrase then, I believe, one step forward and 3/4 of a step backward. That's going to be very problematic right there also. And I believe we all have to realize this as a content creator of superlative content, or truth teller as a religionist, a parent, what have you. To have truths and believe they will set a person free when they receive the next minute or the next day mistruths that chain that person right back down to the ground or drag them under or attempt to, is something I believe we have to realize. The truth will not set us free if we have mistruths chaining us to the ground at the same instant. Truths coming in the eyes and ears, and mistruths chaining us at the ankles, dragging us downward. Pulled upward and pulled downward at the same time, it being a war here, and who knows where one comes out. It might take till very old age to even determine that. Hence my love of the phrase, and I'd like to write a short book about it sometime, in fact. It ain't over till the fat lady sings, as per where one's going to come out in the war, so to speak, of helpful advice and influence versus not so helpful advice and influence.